The little hand in the crowd. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon in downtown Los Angeles, the kind of day where time seemed to slow down just enough for people to remember how to breathe. The city was buzzing, but gently, like a soft hum beneath the usual chaos. Families gathered at the small outdoor film festival held in a public park where blankets spread across the grass and children ran wild with painted faces and sticky hands. The sun dipped behind the tall buildings, casting a golden hue over everything, and for a moment, the world felt like it belonged to the people again. Among the crowd sat a man in a plain black hoodie, jeans slightly worn at the knees, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. No security, no entourage, just a man and a bucket of popcorn quietly enjoying the moment. No one noticed at first. He liked it that way. He didn't need the spotlight anymore, not unless it meant bringing something good into the world. The man was Keanu Reeves, and that day he was just like everyone else. Just 5 rows behind him, a young mother was desperately trying to keep her toddler from climbing the foldable lawn chairs. Her name was Elena, and life hadn't been kind to her lately. Her daughter Sophie, barely 2 years old, was too young to understand the weight her mother carried on her shoulders. The late rent notices, the long shifts at the diner, the lost sleep. But Sophie had energy like fire, and in that moment, her big curious eyes were locked onto one thing: the man with the popcorn. Sophie toddled forward on unsure feet, laughing as she went, escaping her mother's hands for the 100th time that day. Before Elena could even stand, Sophie had reached the man in the black hoodie. She stood in front of him staring, small hands clutching the air. Keanu looked down, unsure if he should speak or stay silent. She didn't say a word. She just reached into his bucket and grabbed a fistful of popcorn, her face lighting up like 1,000 suns. He didn't flinch. Instead, Keanu slowly bent forward, looked her right in the eyes, and whispered with a soft smile, "You must be the bravest girl here." His voice was low, gentle, and kind. Sophie nodded proudly, bits of popcorn falling from her tiny hands onto the grass. Laughter bubbled up from the people nearby who had seen the interaction. But for Keanu, something shifted inside. A memory, distant and painful, stirred beneath the surface. Elena rushed over, cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry," she said, scooping Sophie into her arms. She doesn't understand boundaries yet." Her voice trembled, not just from the awkwardness, but from the fear that this could spiral into something worse. People didn't always show patience to mothers like her. Keanu stood up slowly. Not a single trace of annoyance crossed his face. Instead, he offered the popcorn bucket to Sophie, who was now resting against her mother's shoulder. "It's yours," he said. "She's got good taste." He looked at Elena then, not with pity but with something else. Recognition. Like he'd seen that kind of exhaustion before, worn those same invisible weights. "Please, you don't have to," Elena started, but Keanu gently shook his head. "What's her name?" he asked. "Sophie," she whispered, still in disbelief. She didn't know who he was yet. She just saw kindness in a stranger. The next hour was a blur. Keanu sat beside them, asking questions, laughing with Sophie, who had now decided this mysterious man was her new best friend. Elena was hesitant at first, but something about him felt safe. Normal. She had forgotten what that felt like. She didn't know she was sitting beside one of the most respected actors in the world. As the sun dipped further, the crowd grew, and phones finally started to lift. Whispers of, "Is that him?" passed from one group to the next. Someone shouted, "Hey, that's Keanu Reeves." But by then, it didn't matter. The moment had already happened. He had shared his popcorn with a little girl who didn't know who he was, and in doing so, reminded himself of something he thought he'd lost: connection. But behind the warmth of the moment, something darker loomed. Across the park, a man in a gray suit watched the scene with a clenched jaw. He held a phone in one hand, snapping photo after photo. He wasn't just another curious onlooker. His name was Derek Lawrence, and he wasn't there for the popcorn. He was there for revenge. Keanu didn't know it yet, but this moment of kindness had just painted a target on his back. What started as a small, sweet interaction with a 2-year-old child was about to unravel into something much bigger. A story that would challenge everything he thought he knew about family, sacrifice, and the hidden cost of being good in a world that didn't always reward it. And as the lights of the festival flickered on and the first stars blinked into the sky, Sophie pointed at them and whispered, "Stars for sharing." Keanu smiled, but in the back of his mind a feeling lingered, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. Echoes from a forgotten name. When Keanu Reeves woke the next morning, the sunlight crawling through the cracks in the curtains wasn't the thing that stirred him. It was the memory of a little hand reaching into his popcorn bucket. It wasn't the first time someone had approached him out of pure innocence, but there had been something different about Sophie. Her eyes weren't just curious, they were familiar, haunting in a way he couldn't explain. She reminded him of someone from a long time ago, a memory buried deep under layers of grief and silence. As he poured himself a cup of coffee in his small apartment tucked away in the Hollywood Hills, he couldn't help but wonder why her face kept returning to him like a gentle knock on the heart. He sat on the edge of the couch, flipping open a worn leather notebook filled with thoughts and scribbles he'd collected over the years, quotes, dreams, fragments of scenes never filmed. His fingers paused over a line he had written almost 10 years ago. "We are all just children, hoping someone will share their popcorn." He had no idea back then how real that sentiment would one day feel. A slight smile tugged at the corner of his lips, but it faded when his phone buzzed on the counter. He walked over slowly, still groggy, still deep in thought, and picked up the phone. An unknown number. He stared at it for a moment, then answered with a cautious tone. "Hello?" Deep voice responded, slow and deliberate. "I saw you at the festival yesterday. You haven't changed, Reeves. Still playing the hero." Keanu's shoulders stiffened instantly. The voice wasn't just familiar. It was chilling, like a whisper from another life. A life he thought he had closed the door on. "Who is this?" he asked, though part of him already knew. "You'll find out soon enough," the man said, and then hung up. Keanu stood there for a few moments, holding the phone to his ear long after the call had ended. He hadn't heard that voice in over 15 years. The last time he did, it was in a hospital hallway, filled with echoing footsteps and unanswered questions. The man's name was Derek Lawrence, a name most had forgotten, but Keanu couldn't afford to. Derek had once been a producer, young and hungry, with ambition that burned like acid through anything good. He had been part of a film project early in Keanu's career, one that ended in scandal, betrayal, and a tragic accident that left a young actress named Camille paralyzed. Derek blamed everyone else, especially Keanu, who had walked away from the project the moment he saw what was happening behind the scenes. Derek's name was buried after lawsuits and public outrage, but his resentment had only grown, festering in silence. Now, after all these years, he had resurfaced, and something about his tone sent a clear message. He wasn't just back to talk. Keanu sat down, the notebook still open, and stared at the page without seeing it. He thought about Elena and Sophie. He had planned to visit them that day, to drop off a small gift, a stuffed rabbit for Sophie, and a grocery card for Elena, something discreet and respectful. But now a weight pressed against his chest. What if they weren't just random? What if Derek had known Keanu would be there? What if Sophie's innocent act had been the spark for something darker? Meanwhile, across town, Elena was finishing her shift at the diner. Her hands were sore from carrying trays, her back aching from bending down to pick up what customers left behind without a second thought. But her mind wasn't on the pain, it was on the man from the park. She had finally realized who he was the night before when a clip had gone viral online. Someone had captured the moment Keanu handed Sophie the popcorn and called her brave. The video had spread fast. Comments pouring in, people praising his gentleness, his humility. And there, right in the center of it all, was her daughter, smiling like she owned the world. She should have felt joy, but instead, she felt fear. People had started showing up near the diner, asking questions. Not reporters, not yet, but strange. Men in plain clothes leaning against lampposts, pretending to check their phones while staring through the window. Her instincts screamed. She had run from something before, something she never wanted to face again. Sophie's father, his name, was a secret she never spoke aloud, not even in the safety of her own mind. He had hurt her in ways that left invisible bruises, and when she escaped him 2 years ago, she thought she had finally found peace. But yesterday, when one of those strange men outside the diner leaned in to say, "Nice kid you've got," her blood turned to ice. She called the police, but they brushed it off. "No threat," they said. Probably a misunderstanding. But Elena knew better. Too many people didn't believe women like her until it was too late. As she picked Sophie up from the neighbor's apartment that evening, her hands trembled. Sophie wrapped her arms around her mother's neck and whispered, "Can we see the popcorn man again?" Elena didn't answer. She couldn't, because she didn't know if the popcorn man was safe either. Back in his apartment, Keanu made his decision. He picked up the stuffed rabbit and the envelope with the grocery card and slid them into a small gift bag. He grabbed his keys, locked the door behind him, and stepped into the fading light of day. He knew something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, but he also knew he had to see them, not just to offer kindness, but to protect them from a storm he might have caused without knowing. He didn't realize that as he pulled out of the driveway, a black sedan was already trailing him from the corner. As night crept over the city, the lives of 3 strangers, an actor, a mother, and a child, were slowly beginning to entangle in a web spun from past sins, present dangers, and an uncertain future. And in the back of that black sedan, Derek Lawrence smiled coldly to himself as he watched the taillights fade into the distance. "Time to finish what you started, Reeves," he whispered. Shadows at the door. The apartment where Elena lived was far from glamorous. It was tucked in the back of a faded old complex near the edge of East Hollywood, where the city's pulse slowed to a tired, uneven rhythm. The walls were thin, the paint chipped in places, and the smell of fried onions from the downstairs tenants' cooking lingered long after dinner was done. But to Elena, it was safety. It was the first place in 2 years where she hadn't flinched at night noises or watched the windows with a trembling hand. She had built a fragile peace here, one built on keeping her head down and moving quietly through life. But peace is a delicate thing, and it doesn't take much to crack it wide open. Sophie was asleep, her small chest rising and falling gently under her favorite blanket, the one with the yellow ducks and faded stars. Elena sat beside her, stroking her hair with slow, careful fingers. Her heart was a battlefield of emotions: joy, fear, gratitude, dread. What started as a simple outing to a park had turned into something she couldn't yet understand, and she was haunted by questions she didn't have the strength to ask. Who were those men outside the diner? What did they want? And why did it feel like the walls around her life were closing in again? A knock came at the door. Not loud, not urgent, but soft. Too soft. Elena stood immediately, her body tensed like a wire pulled too tight. She moved quietly to the door and pressed her eye against the peephole, her breath caught in her throat. Standing outside, wearing the same plain black hoodie as the day before, was Keanu Reeves. He held a small bag in one hand and looked for a moment like he was just another neighbor paying a kind visit. But his eyes told another story. They were sharp, watchful, and behind them was something she couldn't quite name. An alertness, a readiness. She opened the door only partway, her body still blocking the entrance. "What are you doing here?" she whispered. Keanu glanced over his shoulder, scanning the hallway, then looked back at her. "Can we talk?" he asked. "I won't stay long." Elena hesitated, then stepped aside. He entered quietly and gently handed her the bag. Inside, the stuffed rabbit and the grocery card she hadn't expected. But what struck her most was the letter folded in the bottom. She looked at it, confused, but before she could speak, Keanu had already walked to the window and pulled the curtain back just an inch. "You were followed today," he said softly. The air in the room shifted. Her legs gave out slightly, and she sank into the old couch, the bag still in her hands. She didn't ask how he knew. Part of her had already suspected it. "Who are they?" he asked, turning to her. She looked down at Sophie's tiny shoes by the door. "I don't know," she lied. He sat across from her, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. "I think you do. And I think it's connected to something from my past, too." He paused. "There's a man named Derek. He's back, and he's watching me. But he was watching you, too." Elena's breath came faster now, her hands gripping the bag so tightly it began to crumple. The silence between them felt like it would shatter at any moment. "His name isn't Derek," she finally said. "But I know that kind of man. The one who smiles with his mouth but never with his eyes. The one who wants control more than love. The one who doesn't let you leave." Keanu nodded slowly. "You ran from him." "I did," she whispered. "And I changed everything. My name, my job, the way I live. I haven't told anyone, not even the police. I just disappeared with my daughter." He leaned back slightly, taking in her words. "What if this isn't just about the past?" he said after a moment. "What if someone is using this moment, your daughter, our meeting, to dig up something that should have stayed buried?" She looked up at him, her voice trembling. "Why would they care about us?" "Because they care about hurting me," he said, "and they know the best way to do that is through someone else." At that, Sophie stirred in the bedroom. Her small voice called out for her mother, and Elena stood quickly, rushing in to comfort her. Keanu remained seated, staring at the crack in the wall across from him, the ticking of the cheap plastic clock above the door growing louder in his ears. The more he pieced things together, the more he realized how carefully this moment had been planned. When Elena returned, holding a sleepy Sophie in her arms, Keanu stood. "You can't stay here," he said firmly. "Not tonight." She hesitated. "Where would we go?" He looked at her with calm certainty. "My place. It's safer. No one knows where it is." She hesitated again, torn between instinct and logic, fear and trust. But as she looked at Sophie's peaceful face, she knew what she had to do. Sometimes trust is all you have left when the world starts to close in. "Okay," she said quietly. Keanu moved swiftly after that, scanning the hallway before leading them down the back stairs. He had parked his motorcycle out front, but for this trip he had rented a quiet car from a local friend. No attention, no trail. They drove in silence, with Sophie asleep in her mother's arms and the city's neon lights flickering against the windows like ghosts. When they arrived at his home, nestled in a wooded part of the hills, Elena gasped softly. It wasn't a mansion, it wasn't even particularly large, but it was peaceful, calm, the kind of place where memories could breathe and pasts could be laid to rest. He led them inside, gave Elena the guest room, and told her to lock the door from the inside. Just in case. Then he sat on the back porch alone, looking out into the trees, thinking about all the moments in his life that had led to this one. He didn't hear the footsteps behind him until it was too late. A sharp sound broke the silence, and before he could turn, he felt a blunt object hit the back of his shoulder. He stumbled forward, catching himself against the railing, spinning to face the attacker, but there was no attacker. Only a recording device, now blinking red, planted just beneath the edge of the porch, where no one should have been able to place it. His blood ran cold. They hadn't just followed him. They had already been here. And if they had been here once, they could come again, inside the house. Elena tucked Sophie in for the second time that night, whispering soft promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Buried secrets and quiet storms. The early morning fog rolled through the hills like a ghost that didn't want to be seen, blanketing the world in a stillness that only deepened the tension inside Keanu's home. He hadn't slept. Not a second. He had spent the night pacing the wooden floors, listening to the creaks in the walls, checking the locks again and again, and watching the tiny red light on the recorder he had found blinking quietly in the corner of the porch. It had taken only a minute to disable it, but the implications rang louder than any alarm. Someone had been in his sanctuary. Someone had violated the one place in the world he kept separate from everything else. His fame, his past, his pain, In the guest room down the hall, Elena stirred awake slowly, her body still tense with fear even in sleep. Sophie lay curled up, beside her, thumb in mouth, unaware of the storm surrounding them. As the morning light crept in through the curtains, Elena opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling, memories clawing their way to the surface like vines breaking through concrete. It wasn't just Keanu's past that had come back. Hers was waking up too. Keanu knocked gently before entering, his face shadowed with exhaustion. He motioned for her to follow him into the kitchen. As she quietly pulled the door closed behind her, she could feel his unease, like a static charge in the air before a lightning strike. "Someone was here," he said simply. "Before we arrived. They planted something outside." Elena didn't flinch. She had known it deep down, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that bruised her hope. She sat at the small kitchen table, her fingers tracing the grain in the wood. "This doesn't make sense," she said softly. "I disappeared. I changed everything. No one should know where I am." Keanu sat across from her and folded his hands. "They know. Not by chance. Not because of you. It's because of me." He paused. "And what happened with Derek?" "It was worse than I told you." The weight in the room deepened. Keanu took a slow breath and began to speak, not as the man the world knew, but as a man who had carried a silent burden for far too long. Years ago, during the early stages of his career, he had signed onto a project with potential, an indie film that promised depth, art, and integrity. Derek Lawrence had been a young executive on the project, charming, brilliant, but ruthless, beneath the surface. It had started with small things, pushing the crew harder than necessary, cutting corners on safety. Keanu had objected more than once, especially when it came to Camille, a talented young actress whose stunts were not supposed to involve real risk. One night, while filming an intense rooftop scene, Derek had insisted they keep rolling despite strong winds. No harness, no backup crew. Keanu had fought to stop it, argued until his voice broke, but Derek pulled rank and forced the shot. That night, Camille fell. The silence after her scream was something Keanu never forgot. Her life was changed forever. She survived, but she never walked again. The fallout was immediate. The production company dissolved, lawsuits followed, and Derek vanished into the shadows. Keanu tried to reach Camille for years, tried to help, but she withdrew from everyone, blaming herself, the industry, and quietly, him. He had walked away from that set and never looked back. But Derek hadn't. "He thinks I ruined his career," Keanu said, voice low. "But the truth is, he did it to himself. Now he's looking to settle a score, and he's using you to do it." Elena stared at him, horrified not just by the story, but by the realization that they were now part of a bigger game. One neither of them had chosen to play. "Why me?" she asked. "Why my daughter?" Keanu's eyes softened. "Because you matter. Because you're kind. Because he knows I care. And hurting people I care about is how he wins." Elena looked down at her hands, trembling slightly. "Then what do we do?" Keanu stood. "We find him before he finds us." Hours later, they were in the city again, careful, quiet, moving like shadows through the noise. Keanu had called in a favor from an old friend, a retired investigator who had once worked celebrity security, but now spent his days in a quiet office filled with dusty files and ancient computers. His name was Ed, and he owed Keanu more than one life-saving call. Ed met them in the back of a bookstore he owned under a false name. His eyes, sharp behind thick glasses, scanned Elena carefully before nodding in understanding. He listened as Keanu explained the situation, nodded again, and then leaned back in his chair. "Derek Lawrence disappeared for a reason," Ed said. "But I heard whispers last year. He resurfaced in Europe. Some offshore investments, shady, tech startup. But here's the strange part. Someone matching his description flew into LAX 3 days ago. Fake name. High security clearance. Someone is backing him. Someone powerful." Keanu frowned. "Someone with money?" "Money. Reach. Silence. All three." Elena shifted uncomfortably. He's not working alone. No, Ed agreed. And the more public this gets, the more dangerous it becomes. But that was the problem. Public was already out of their control. The video of Sophie stealing the popcorn had gone viral. News outlets had picked it up. Everyone loved the story. It was trending under Our Popcorn Girl and KeanuReeves. It was beautiful, wholesome, heart-melting, and a perfect distraction for something darker beneath the surface. Keanu clenched his jaw. He used that moment to trace us. All he needed was a face, and the internet gave it to him. On the way back to the car, Elena's phone buzzed. An unknown number. She stared at it, a chill running down her spine. Don't speak. Just listen. The voice on the other end was gravel and venom. You took something from me. Now I'll take something from you. Her knees buckled slightly. She dropped the phone, her hand covering her mouth. Keanu caught her before she fell. What did he say? Her voice shook as she whispered, He's coming for Sophie. Keanu didn't speak. He turned, eyes burning with something deeper than rage. He took Elena by the hand and walked quickly to the car, locking the doors the moment they got in. He drove fast but careful, every turn measured, every lane change watched. They didn't go back to his house. They went somewhere else. A cabin, hidden deep in the woods north of the city, a place no one knew existed but him. It belonged to a friend who had passed away years ago, and it had never been registered in Keanu's name. It was off-grid, quiet, protected by more than just trees. As night fell over the hills again, Sophie played quietly by the fireplace, the stuffed rabbit in her arms. Elena sat nearby, unable to stop the tears from slipping down her cheeks. Keanu stood outside watching the trees, watching for shadows. He had kept a secret long enough, but now the past was coming, and this time, it wasn't just his life on the line. The fire between the trees deep in the woods where the sky disappeared behind tall pine branches and even the wind seemed to whisper in secrecy, Keanu stood motionless beside the cabin porch. The night was cold and silent, but his mind was anything but. There was no comfort in the quiet, only an eerie stillness as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Inside the cabin, Sophie was finally asleep again, her tiny hand clutching the ear of the stuffed rabbit. Elena sat beside her, unmoving, listening to every creak in the wooden walls. She didn't feel safe anymore, not even in a hidden place, far from the world, because fear like hers didn't need geography. It lived inside her. Keanu knew the feeling, not just fear, but the burden of always looking over your shoulder, of feeling like any moment of peace was a trap laid just before the storm. It was the same feeling that had chased him for years after Camille's accident, the same guilt that stayed even after the world had moved on. But this was different. This wasn't about guilt anymore. This was about protection. This was about choosing to stand between the innocent and the evil, and this time he would not be late. He was finishing another lap around the cabin when a distant sound broke through the woods, a branch snapping, not from wind, but weight. He froze. His hand moved instantly to the small emergency radio clipped to his belt, the only connection to the outside world out here. He tapped it twice, signaling to Ed, who had stayed behind in the city to watch for movement. The signal came, back static. No voice, just a low, buzzing silence. Something was wrong. Keanu moved quickly, silently, slipping around the side of the cabin and down the slope where the moonlight barely reached. The flashlight stayed off. He trusted his feet more than any beam of light that could give away his position. He crept down toward the tree line, where the shadows grew thick and dense, and where the sound had come from. And there, between the brush, he saw it, a motion sensor camera wired and blinking, half buried in a pile of wet leaves. His jaw tightened. They had found the cabin. He yanked it out, crushed it beneath his boot and turned back up the hill. But before he reached the porch, another sound stopped him cold. This one was closer. A voice, soft, calculated, crawling through the trees like a snake made of smoke. You really think you can hide, Keanu? After all these years, you still think you're the hero? Keanu turned, his breath slow and controlled. "Derek," he said into the darkness. "Come out." From between the trees, a figure emerged, slowly. Not dressed like a hunter or criminal, but like a businessman who had lost all need for appearances. Black coat, neat gloves, and a face still twisted with ambition. Derek Lawrence smiled, his teeth white even in the dim light, his eyes sharp and soulless. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," Derek said, stepping closer, "but you made that choice for me. When you exposed me, when you walked away from the project and let the world believe I was the villain. You were the villain," Keanu said calmly. "Camille was the one who paid for your greed. She was weak," Derek snapped. "You always took her side. You took everyone's side but mine. You ruined me. And now," he paused, smiling wider, "now I get to ruin you." Keanu didn't move. "You came for me, but you touched a child, a mother. They have nothing to do with this." Derek tilted his head. "Don't they? It was the girl who went viral, remember? The popcorn moment, the perfect story. The internet loves you again. But I know you, and I know your weakness. You still care. That makes you predictable." Keanu's voice dropped low. "It makes me human." A beat passed between them. Cold. Electric. Then, without warning, Derek's eyes flicked upward, and Keanu turned instinctively. The cabin door had creaked open. Elena stood there, eyes wide, holding Sophie in her arms. She had heard everything. "Go inside," Keanu said quickly, but his voice didn't reach her in time. Derek raised a hand. A red dot appeared on Keanu's chest. "Sniper, from the woods." Keanu dove forward, pushing Elena and Sophie back into the cabin, just as the crack of the rifle broke through the night. Glass shattered, wood splintered. A picture frame exploded behind the doorframe. Inside, Elena screamed, shielding Sophie with her body. Keanu rolled to the ground, kicked the door shut behind him, and slammed the bolt into place. He grabbed the emergency radio, twisted the dial, and shouted, "Code Red! Code Red! They found us!" Static. Then Ed's voice, barely audible, laced with panic. "They hit the tower, back up down. You're alone." Keanu didn't waste time. He moved through the cabin with precision, grabbing the emergency bag he had stashed under the stairs, checking the contents. Cash, burner phone, flare gun, and a map marked with 2 alternate escape routes. He handed Elena the bag and looked her dead in the eyes. "We have to go now," he said. Elena, trembling, held Sophie tight. "What about you? I'll buy time." "No," she said firmly. "Not again. Not for us." "You don't get it," Keanu said, his voice breaking for the first time. "You are the only good thing left in this story." Outside, another gunshot cracked the air. This one hit the water tank near the back of the cabin. The pressure hissed like a warning. Keanu opened the trapdoor to the hidden crawl space, led them down into the narrow passage that exited into the woods behind the ridge. He gave Elena the flare gun and kissed Sophie gently on the forehead. "You're the bravest girl in the world," he whispered. Elena hesitated at the threshold, tears filling her eyes. "Promise me you'll follow." "I will," he lied. She disappeared into the tunnel. Keanu climbed back into the cabin and locked the trapdoor shut. He turned, and in the flickering firelight, Derek stood in the open doorway, gun in hand. "Always the martyr," Derek said with a smirk. "I almost admire it." Keanu raised his hand slowly. "They're gone. It's over. Not until I say it's over." Derek growled. He stepped inside. But Keanu had already moved. The flare gun was still loaded. With one motion, he fired it into the ceiling beam. Flames erupted. Derek screamed. Smoke swallowed the room in seconds. Keanu burst through the back window, landing hard on the frozen ground, sprinting through the woods as fire consumed the cabin behind him. His lungs burned, branches ripped at his skin, but all that mattered was reaching the road and keeping the promise he had just made. Because somewhere in the dark, Elena and Sophie were running for their lives, and he wasn't about to let the story end here. When kindness becomes a shield, the forest was no longer silent. The flames from the cabin crackled in the distance, throwing orange flashes against the black sky like a warning from nature itself. Birds screeched and fled from the treetops. The ground trembled with the rage of the fire behind them. But Keanu didn't slow down. His boots pounded the earth, heartbeat hammering in sync, lungs burning with every breath. Somewhere ahead, Elena was running. Somewhere ahead, Sophie was clinging to her mother, terrified and trusting. And behind him, Derek was still alive. The cabin may have slowed him, may have wounded him, but Keanu knew men like Derek didn't stop until something broke. He reached the split in the path, saw the first sign carved into the trunk of an old tree, a notch he had made years ago when he first scouted this forest as a place for peace, never expecting it would one day become a battlefield. He turned left, racing down the slope, branches whipping across his face, mud pulling at his legs, but nothing could stop him now. Not when their safety was at stake. Meanwhile, Elena was stumbling through the underbrush, each step heavier than the last. Her legs ached, her arms trembled from holding Sophie so tight, and her eyes scanned the woods wildly, unsure of which direction led to freedom and which to danger. But Sophie, somehow, had fallen asleep in her arms, exhausted by fear, soothed by her mother's heartbeat, believing in something even now. And that belief gave Elena strength. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stop. Then, out of the darkness, a light, a single flare rising slowly above the treetops, bright red against the sky. It was Keanu's signal. Elena turned toward it without hesitation. She followed the light through thorns and branches across the shallow creek, past the abandoned hunting shack until finally she broke through to a clearing. And there he was, Keanu breathing hard, covered in soot and cuts, waiting with outstretched arms. She ran to him. "They're still behind us," he said urgently. "We have to keep moving. There's a safe house 2 miles east, but we have to go now." Elena nodded, her voice gone, her body held together only by adrenaline and fear. They ran. For nearly 20 minutes, they moved without words, only breath, only footsteps, only the pounding silence of pursuit. And then, just as the trees began to thin and the moonlight stretched wide across the clearing, they reached it. A small, half-buried building made of stone and iron, locked with an old key Keanu kept around his neck. It had once belonged to a survivalist friend long since passed, and now it was their last hope. He unlocked the door, pulled it open, and ushered them inside. The air was cold and dry, shelves lined with supplies, old generator humming faintly in the corner, radio unit covered in dust. They were safe, for now. Keanu secured the door, then knelt beside Sophie, who had finally woken up. Her eyes were wide but not afraid. She reached up and touched a scratch on his cheek, frowning softly. "You got hurt," she whispered. Keanu smiled, his voice breaking. "A little, but you're okay, and that's what matters." She leaned in and kissed his forehead. "You're my popcorn man." His throat tightened. He couldn't speak. Behind them, Elena watched, her body weak, her heart stronger than ever. She had never believed in heroes, not since she was a little girl, but now, watching this man protect her and her daughter without expecting anything in return, she realized something. Keanu wasn't just a hero because of what he did. He was a hero because of who he chose to be. When no one was watching, the radio crackled suddenly, pulling them back to the moment. A voice. "Keanu, it's Ed. I tracked the signal. Derek's down." "I repeat, he's down. Fire department reached the cabin. He was caught in the collapse. But there's a problem. He wasn't alone. There were others. They're still out there." Keanu took a breath. "How many?" "2 that we know of. Possibly more. But here's the thing. One of them left something behind." "What?" Keanu asked. Ed's voice was grave. "A photo of Sophie, with a target drawn over it." Elena gasped, pulling Sophie close again. Keanu clenched his fists, rage mixing with dread. This wasn't over. But then Ed continued. "Listen to me. I've made calls, people who owe you. Favors from years ago. You're not alone in this. We're pulling together a team. We'll get you out. Safe. But you have to wait. 24 hours. Can you hold? Keanu looked around the room, at the thick walls, at Elena's tired eyes, at Sophie's small hands. We'll hold, he said. And for the next day, they stayed in the bunker. They took turns sleeping, watching the monitors, listening to the radio. Keanu told stories to Sophie, who listened with wide eyes, smiling again for the first time since the festival. He made her laugh with silly voices, gave her the last piece of candy from his pocket, and when she asked him why he was helping them, he answered simply, because the world needs more people who protect the good things. Finally, as dawn broke the next morning, the sound of tires rolling over gravel echoed through the woods. It was Ed, and behind him, 2 armored vehicles and a dozen men who owed Keanu more than money. They escorted Elena and Sophie to a new home. One, with security, anonymity, and peace. Elena cried when they said goodbye. Sophie clung to Keanu's neck, refusing to let go. Will I see you again? She asked. He smiled gently. Yes, you'll see me and every good person who shares their popcorn. And then he kissed her on the forehead just like the first night and stepped back. Weeks passed. The story faded from the headlines. The video of the little girl who stole popcorn from Keanu Reeves lived on, becoming a symbol of pure kindness in a world too used to cruelty. No one ever knew the real story. The danger, the sacrifice, the fire in the woods. But Elena did, and so did Sophie. And every year on the same Sunday, a small package would arrive at their new home, always addressed to the bravest girl in the world. Inside, there was always popcorn and a note that simply said, "Kindness is the strongest shield." The popcorn man,